All right, we are live.
Okay.
All right, so yeah, say hi in the comments as you are doing. Laura, Carol, Debbie,
Oh my gosh,
Ray.
everybody's ready. Look at.
I know.
Ah,
We've shown up late to our own party.
I know.
Kathy, been struggling with the structure because I know forming a story can be a jello-y mess. It sure, yes, it sure can.
Oh, Catherine, you're in Hawaii.
Um,
Hi, Sandra.
Sandra, Toronto, right on.
Oh, Jane, hi.
Jane, Argus Moon O'Malley.
Moon O'Malley. Who are you? I love that name.
Yeah, I do love that name. I hope that's her actual full name.
Yeah.
Maria, Lisa, Jennifer, Joanne,
Hi, Jen.
Carol, Mary Beth's back, Joanne, Maggie. Bright spot of your week. All right.
Oh, no, that's so nice.
That's great.
Mine too. I look forward to it.
Yeah, for
I do.
sure. Chuck, welcome back. D's our Hawaii representative. I think
Second one. You have two.
Yeah, I think, I don't know sure if Kathy is in Hawaii, but she has Hawaiian roots.
Oh.
Yeah. Indiana, we've got
Hi, Jella.
all right.
Jen.
Wow. Holy cow, there's a lot of people here.
I know, it's so fun.
It is fun.
But really quiet in my house without you guys. You guys are very quiet.
Jersey. Della's back. Lita from the UK. Love having the span from Hawaii to the UK.
Hi, Ann.
Tracy, Bobby. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming back. And if you're watching this on replay, thanks for seeing it again. Madeline, Heidi, Amy, Lou, Nazreen.
Peanut. Come here.
Peanut making some problems.
Yeah, he was here, but
all right. So we're talking about story structure this week, and we will do. I'll get right into it since we're just going to reiterate a few things right off the bat. So previous sessions. Obviously, you know, some people have seen everything with us and some people haven't. And even if you have, I think it's nice to just get a reminder of what we've gone over.
Yeah.
So we discussed creating the short synopsis for several story ideas. So that was our first week of this back 5 weeks ago. And so Ann had done this with her agent where she wrote up synopses for 5 or 6 ideas and sent them to her agent, and her agent ranked them. And so even if you're agentless, you can do this by creating these story ideas, running them by people, seeing which one seems to garner the most interest.
Yeah.
Ann has recently done this again for kind of her next batch of things when she was waiting for edits on her most recent book. So it's a good process. It gets the ideas flowing pretty well. Yeah. We talked about this brief, like 100 to 200 word synopsis. 150 to 200 word is usually what a back cover synopsis is. I, by the way, stumbled upon this contest, which I posted on Twitter and Facebook, I think. And if you guys want it, you can email me and figure out the link for it. But it's queryletter.com or something. And they're having a contest where you write a 100-word synopsis for a back cover synopsis for a book you haven't written.
Oh.
So it's totally conceptual, which is kind of fun. So it's a 100-word thing that you submit to them, and then there's a first prize, and I don't know what their other prizes are, but there's the monetary prize for winning that contest. So, you know, pretty something worth trying, and it could be, you know, your next book. So back cover synopsis that hooks readers, but it doesn't quite reveal the whole story is the point of that, and it's pretty premise heavy. And so then we talked about writing forward, though, from the character and not from the premise. So that back cover synopsis gets you your premise and your idea and the hook and everything, but it's not a story yet. Then we talked about figuring out what your character wants and how that takes a lot of thought. And so this is what we did last time, is we were sort of thinking out loud, testing out this story concept of this person who sees someone else leave these bags of food, based on a true story, bags of food out near a dumpster. And we figured the protagonist is probably that person observing all of this and wanting some connection to people, but being kind of a permanent shut in for reasons other than what we're all facing. So, and we alluded to this last time about the desire, that the thing that they want, that there are layers to it. There has to be some sort of concrete desire, some sort of concrete thing that they're after, but there are layers below that. There's a subconscious desire, there's an abstract underlying desire, there's the thing the character doesn't know they need. And just before this, Anne and I were talking about her novel Dog Year, where and I'll turn off the say hello in the comments now, but in her novel Dog Year, where the character's husband dies, and really what she wants then at the outset is to regain a sense of stability. She wants to have him back, really. But of course, that's something that can't ever happen, right? So she wants to regain a sense of stability. She wants to regain a sense of family. But what she's going to discover over the course of that novel is, because she can't get what she actually wants, she's going to have to sort of tweak her desire a little bit, right?
She's got to be shoved into thinking that chances are what she wants is not really what she needs. And we do that all the time. Like on a regular basis, we think, I thought I wanted this. And then you realize that you want something else. I feel like that's my entire life. I'm ridiculous that way. I feel like I can't learn any lessons because I'm constantly having to learn the same lesson over and over of what I think I want, and then I actually want something else. And one of the ways that I've always said is that if you want to figure out what you want, you just look at your own behavior, because we do what we want. And people can argue that all the time, but I, after having taught health for 30 years, I know full well that people do what they want to do. Often we think we want something, and we want something like a gift, maybe, but our true wants are things that we really go for, right? And one of the things is barring the kind, like a good example of that is you guys being here, honestly, because there's a lot of things you could do with this time. And especially since some of you have made time for it, some of you have scheduled time for it. Maybe, there's a lot of people that are not here because they have work-related things that they absolutely can't get out of. I get that. But I'm just saying that you could be sitting with your feet up outside in the sun right now. But you're not. You're here. So you must want this. And you're showing your want by your behavior. And so I think that our characters, we have to sort of know them so in and out and learn about them as we write about them, as they, as we watch them do what they want to do, and as we watch them change their lives, we get to analyze their behavior in terms of what we really think they need and what they want. And so I like it just fine when you're not around. Tig, it looks like what she wants is she wants someone to help her with her mom. Her mom has Alzheimer's. Her older sister is kind of a wild child and never helps. She's constantly she's the caretaker, and she's tired, and she just needs a break. Instead of that, she gets none of those things. And actually, in the end, it's not so much that she wants help from her sister. She wants the world to be a fair place. And of course, she's not going to be able to get that, right? So what she has to learn is that the world isn't going to be a fair place. And she's got to figure out a way to go forward. It's one thing to be like, world is not fair, but then you can walk around sort of kicking rocks the rest of your life. And people do that. That people have a conflict they cannot get past, and they are unpleasant to be around. They're constantly sort of kicking rocks. But we can't, sure, that's true. That is what happens, but we can't really have that in our stories, because our readers are looking for lessons and satisfaction and understanding themselves through the behavior of the characters. And they're reading it for the same reasons that I'm writing it, to understand how to get what I want when I have all of the barriers in front of me. And then I have to discover whether it's something I wanted after all, and why I wanted it. Right. And maybe the reason why I wanted it is not a healthy reason. And then we have to figure that out too. I mean, counselors, good Lord, that's what they're for.
Right, exactly.
So we're book writing counselors in a way. And so,
Yeah.
but one of the things that we said very clearly last time was you have to figure out what they want. But what we want to talk a little bit more about today as we move into story structure is that it's a complicated, it's not usually one thing. I want this. It's like, I want this. And then something happens and they go, okay, then I'll want this. And then something happens and they're like, well, okay, I guess I'll get this. And to the point where they finally have to figure out through these barriers what it is they're going to get. So when I was a little kid, I always kind of tell this story because my brother just terrorized me. Just was a terrorist, and I always felt. And the end of the night, before my parents came home from babysitting, we were sort of babysitting each other. He would beg for forgiveness and say, "Please don't tell Dad," because Dad was the disciplinarian, you know. And but he would run through the house with a glass of water and constantly try to throw water on me. Like I'd be sitting reading a book and he'd come around the corner and whip water at me. And I would be running through the house, and while he was after me, I would shut doors and throw chairs in front of him and dump pillows. And I would just be like through the house like a bull, throwing stuff in his way. He wanted to get me. I wanted to not be gotten. Right? And so that's what we're doing to our characters. And we're moving through. I just really wanted to be left alone. That's what I wanted. I didn't really I wanted it to be not gotten, but I really wanted to be left alone. And I probably could have gotten left alone if I would have told my dad, because who knows what would have happened after that. But I also wanted to save him from the anger of my father. So there are multiple desires behind that. So why did I run through the house instead of calling my parents or going into my room, locking the door and saying, I'm telling my folks, period? Because people are complicated and we're emotional and we feel empathy and we give people second chances. And so in the end, we have to figure out, what do you really want? Well, what I really wanted was peace. And I wasn't going to get it telling my dad. And I wasn't going to get it just running away from Ray. Did I ever get peace in that house? I think eventually, yeah, because my brother started doing drugs and then he got in big trouble and my dad really was involved. It went from throwing water on me to doing drugs. But, and then my dad just sort of left me alone. But and what I might have learned from that was maybe I wanted a little of my dad's attention. And maybe I didn't want peace. So do you see how all of that changes as we go along? You were trying to write an essay about yourself and you'll be like, oh my God, it's so hard to write all that.
Right.
You're like, oh, maybe I wanted this then, or did I want this? And what about this? So you have to, like, I think going back to the comment early on, structure is it's hard because it can be a really big jelly mess. That's why.
Yeah, exactly.
So how to clean up that jelly is to really hone in and understand your character. Now, let me just tell you one more time that I've written my book. I'm going through edits right now. These could be close to the final edits. And only in my last edits did I actually write a timeline. And I am just now focusing really down into the greatest and the best arc of my character. I've had it, but now I'm carving it through the help of an excellent editor who is pointing it out to me. Wherever she's always like, I think maybe this is a spot you could talk about it, you know, and the edits are taking a really long time because this is the whittling and the sanding.
Yeah.
You know, like I think I used this as an example before, like when my dad used to carve birds, and at first it was just like, you couldn't even tell what it was, but before long he was using smaller tools and sanding the head so it came out right and the long beak. So that's what I'm doing now. And I wish it was just commas, but it's not. It's creating whole memories based on this character that I've created. And figuring out for sure what she really wanted, really from a young age, and justifying that in the backstory of her life, because you have to have a reason for it.
And so some of these things, like I think what we're seeing is that the desire you know, you have what the character wants, and that's really going to be tied up with the conflicts that they're facing, right?
Mhm,
It's really hard to sort of extricate those two things when you really get into the story.
mhm.
Um, and yeah, so that's part of what structure does, and we'll get to this. I might be getting slightly ahead of myself, but structure allows that it makes that whole thing a little bit more manageable at the outset, so that you have somewhat of a roadmap.
Yeah.
And even though you're going to be doing plenty of other sort of extemporaneous inventing of things as you go, it gives you sort of that roadmap. Um, I just want to reiterate, because I sort of discovered we didn't do this on purpose, but I think this is actually
We did.
accidentally a good teaching technique that I might use on purpose next time, which is that our first session we talked about those synopses and creating the 5 of them, etc. And then there was overlap, because the next time we talked about Ann's 5 questions. You guys remember that? Like, when did you first come up with this idea? Why is it important to you? Those sorts of things, which then got us to and who is it about and what do they get, right?
Mhm,
But premise was really the overlap between 1 and 2 there.
mhm,
And then who is it about and what do they get, to the next week, where we were talking about character and sort of feeling out, like, okay, who is this invented character in the story we haven't written?
mhm,
Um, and so their character was the overlap. Um,
mhm.
and then at the end of last week, we were talking about, now you figure out what stands in their way. And we're really going to be reiterating some of that stuff this week. So conflict is going to be the overlap, the big overlap between last week and this week.
Mhm.
And with that in mind, I think the challenge now is, if you have a character and what they want, and this is basically your words, Anne, because you said this to me as we were talking last weekend, you assume all you have to do is put obstacles in front of them, right? But that's not going to work.
Mm-mm.
That can create a really sort of flat, predictable story where the reader figures it out. Okay, they wanted this and they jumped over this hurdle and they got past it, and now they're going to go on to the next thing. And we don't want just hurdles in the way to things.
Mm-mm.
We want detours, right? More detours than hurdles, I suppose.
Yeah, they need to be exponentially created. Like, one thing they jump over has to cause kind of another problem. It can't solve their problem. It has to make things harder and harder and harder. At least that's what makes things really interesting in a book. I was reading someone's novel, and they had everything they needed in terms of conflict, conflict, conflict. But one of the things that I noticed, that I just was like, why is this book so boring? And I realized that it was because they were just doing conflict hopping, hopping, hopping. And we never, like, I just learned, like a dog learns, that there's going to be a resolution at the end of this conflict. There's no point in reading. Like, I just was like, it's not changing the character really. It's not adding to the story. It's not making it, like, I always think, you know how Rocky and Bullwinkle, like, at the very climax of the cartoon, he goes, looks like this is the end. And that's it. Like, that's what you have to feel like. Oh my gosh. And then, oh no, I can't believe that happened. Are you kidding me? And what now? Oh no. You have to sort of get the reader to feel sort of that way. Like, oh my God, what are they going to do now? Because
Mhm.
they burned down all the bridges behind them, and they're moving forward. So we want to make sure that not only do the conflicts fit the desire or bump off this particular desire of the person, but then they also have to, accelerate the story. They have to make her thing more difficult, because in some ways they're doing this. We're making this so freaking hard that you have to change your mind. You have.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think I talked about this, and maybe I feel like I told this story before, about the old man that climbed Everest, and he was going to be the oldest person that climbed Everest.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
what I found at the end of it was not that climbing Everest was that important, but it was more important to be with his family.
yeah.
Remember, because he was going to die at the top of it.
Right, right.
The storm, and he could have gone on and he could have lived. I mean, for sure. But he was like, no, I've got a grandchild now. And so
Yeah,
he gave up that. But, it was not a small thing for a 70-year-old man or anyone really to climb Everest. I mean, it's a very expensive thing. You have to get Sherpas, and you have to be fit, and you have to have oxygen, and like, it's cold and rigorous. So it's not like he just gave up this thing. It was probably, a 15 to 20-year hope, dream that he was
Right.
looking for.
Right.
You know, and so when he got to the, oh yeah, I did say it because you knew the name, something step. What is it again? I'm breaking it.
Hillary or something like that.
Step, right? This looks like this is the end, and in fact, it kind of was. But he learned a little truth, which was, you know, sometimes my grandson, something as small as that, is more important than making the record books for the rest of your life.
Right. So this idea of taking the character in a new direction, that they can't just, again, it's not just an obstacle, it's something that is going to force a sort of a new path, right?
I want fame, he says, and we find it. And at the very end, it's just kidding. I just want to see my grandson.
Right. Right.
Which is, you know, so many of us have to get there. I know that I've become a different person than I set out to be because of things that I've chosen, right? Chosen to either push through or let go.
And we were discussing an analogy of like, if someone wants to lose weight or get in shape, you know, the most boring story there is, and so they got up and they didn't want to work out, but they did. And then the next day they got up and they didn't want to work out, but they did, right? And so like what we need is for you to like, and they got up and they didn't want to work out and they went out and they twisted their ankle, right? And so now it's a new direction, right?
Right.
Okay, so moving on to the structure, the logic of structure here, right? Oh, and I should say, because it's a good example, actually, the novel you're working on right now is like a road trip novel. And at no point in this do you have a flat tire, for instance.
Nope.
Because it's a pretty predictable obstacle. And what would that do? They're just gonna, oh, it's a flat tire, and now we have to change it. And I mean, I suppose you could use that to like, it's a flat tire, we don't have a spare, we have to go into this town, and they meet someone new who's then, you know, helps them out in some way. But yeah, so just thinking about what sorts of conflicts are going to be pushing your character.
And I think the example of the flat tire is even so much as it's an obvious thing on a road trip book, right? That a flash tire or car trouble or something like that could cause a problem. But is that going to be the problem for the two people in the car? Like it'll make them late. It'll slow them down. It'll force them to spend more time together. But there are other ways that I can do that can even make that whole thing even harder. So, and because of the multiple goals of the story and the characters and the other characters, you know, that are in the book, there's got to be something else. They're already stuffed in a car. Now we're going to stuff them in the car on the side of the road with a tire. Give them something else. And so instead, I gave them something else. And I like things a little bit different. I don't want to see the predictable thing always. I kind of try to think of if it's my first idea, sometimes I'll give it up and I'll walk away from it and I'll go to the next thing.
Yeah.
Just because I think it's probably what everybody's thinking.
Yeah.
So let's see, where are we? I just started talking. I think I lost.
Oh yeah.
There, but
we're talking about the not having the predictable thing. Yeah, and not just thrusting barriers in front of the character, but trying to push them in a new direction. Yeah,
and trying to make sure that the whatever barriers we have always are their Waterloo and always makes it worse and forces them to go in a different direction. And Tim has this great line there, structure is the training program that gets them into shape. And that's what we're going to be kind of talking about, because when I was talking about how when you have a problem that is easily solved, it looks like this, and then it's flat. But we know from story structure that there are really good ways to tell a story that are super compelling. Now, as a nod to all MFAs and people who do different kinds of exploratory writing and lots of books that I've been reading recently, I mean, you can think of George Saunders, all of his work. and several other kinds of stories that are done that aren't told in the traditional sense. This is not to say that you can't be experimental and do those kinds of things. Knock yourself out. Go ahead. But and I guess that's for people that are working in an MFA that need. My daughter is a nurse, and we've been talking on the phone about hospital stuff, and MRI kept coming up. The MFA people, they're there for artistic reasons. They're fooling around with sentences. They're learning structure. They're learning how to do all kinds of different things. But for those of us that are writing a novel that we want to traditionally sort of entertain and tell a story, it's pretty well defined what people like and how we can do that through many, many masters of storytelling far before us. Mm-hmm. If you watch a movie, the worst thing about becoming a writer is that it's no more fun, because I can always tell when the midpoint reversal is and when I can go to the bathroom in between and when things are going to go slow down. So it does kind of, it changes the story for you. But that's what we want to talk a little bit about today. Am I getting ahead of myself?
Not much, no. That's kind of the next thing, which is it's tied up with this thing too, which is just the logic of structure is that it gives you some pillars to the edifice, so to speak, right? It highlights the places in which a character will be pushed in a new direction. Mm-hmm. So you kind of think a bit ahead of time about some of the major parts of the story where, okay, this is going to push them in a new direction. And you may not know some of the kind of micro ways in which that's going to happen between those, but at least you'll know like some of the major pillars. And you'll think it also gets you thinking about just sort of their character trajectory. So that's the logic of thinking about some of this stuff ahead of time. But what you were just talking about was also like the classic story structure. It's appealing to the human brain. As you said, it's sort of time tested. It's been done a lot and it's proven to work. It helps avoid that sagging middle because you have lots happening there in the middle that are pushing the character in new directions. And it also helps a lot with pacing. I also, last year when I was teaching my story structure class at Right by the Lake, I did a lot of sort of deep dives into stories. And it turns out actually George Saunders, his only novel, Lincoln and the Bardo, it has a midpoint that is precisely 50% of the way through the story. Really? It really does. Yeah. It's kind of amazing that I think even these literary novels, maybe without even knowing it, they have a lot of these structural sort of pillars. But I don't know if you want to say anything about pacing and help you ahead of time.
A little bit of pacing, because people are always thinking tension and cliffhangers, and they're always thinking, keeping things interesting. But pacing is also giving people a little bit of a break. I always use the example between kidney stones and labor, and kidney stones are very painful. I've had a kidney stone and I've had 2 babies, so I have an experience in both of those. And I would say that while kidney stones are very, very painful, labor is more interesting and worse. If you spend a lot of time talking about kidney stones with people, this is what you hear. Oh God, that hurt. I got a lot of drugs. And then I passed it. And then I felt better. And I hope I never have one again. But if you talk to women about their birthing stories, good God, they will, number one, they remember every contraction, but also each one is different. And one of the things that makes it so compelling is that you never know when the next contraction is coming. There's a lot of anticipation. So that means there's a contraction and then a rest. And that rest lets us all worry a little. Like, it lets us rest, but it also, we know it's coming. And I think one of the most stressful things for me in childbirth was I never really knew when another one was coming. You kind of know, but and you kind of hope it just doesn't come and the baby comes, or the baby just appears, which would be the best, but it doesn't do that. And so that's why labor is so interesting. There's all this anticipation. So pacing is not hitting the gas pedal all the time and keeping everybody conflict. Pacing also gives us a moment of reflection, a time between, so that we can pick up some of the backstory, make sure that we have these emotions right, understanding the character, and then move on to the next thing. It gives us a time when we get to really invest emotionally in our character. And if we invest emotionally in our character, I don't care what book you're reading, you're going to care whether that person makes it through. One of the best books, I think one of the books that I've read in the last couple of years, The City of Thieves. And he actually is the showrunner for Game of Thrones.
Right.
Oh my gosh, that's a good book. And one of the reasons it's so good, it's small actually, and it's filled with terrific conflict. But you really are into the story. And honestly, 1917, I just saw 1917, which I thought I was going to have a heart attack through the entire movie.
Yeah.
But only because you're madly in love with those boys. You're just see every boy you've ever known in the face of those boys. And without that, and they start the movie running. So pretty much running. So it's not like we spend a lot of time seeing who they are in their backstory, but we absolutely find out who they are through the course of it, and always in the smaller moments that we get that. So pacing is about that kind giving us all a rest in between. Not, even though I said, we want things to escalate, we do, but we also need a minute. That's all of us do, to need a minute to invest,
Right. So there are lots of paradigms for story structure, and we're not necessarily proponents of one over another. I think all writers should probably be familiar with the hero's journey. And Sid Field was, I think, one of the first in film to sort of lay out the 3-act structure with various plot points and the pinch point and all of those sorts of things. There's various, I call them plot point paradigms, where they have inciting incident, pinch point number 1, plot point number 1. Like they vary, midpoint, they vary with their language, but they basically have these very generic sort of plot point labels for things. And there's dozens of them out there. What's that?
Search them out. You can Google them.
Right.
And they fit different genres. And I'm sure you guys all know this, like adventure stories or, apocalyptic stories or something like that usually follow the hero's journey. The Hobbit was the hero's journey.
Right.
Certainly the Hunger Games was, but that's not to say that is just for genre fiction. We see all kinds. There's a lot of mishmash all over the place, but some of the more clear examples are things like that. And so you've seen them always. And depending on what genre you're writing for, probably take a look and see what kinds of books they are and what kind of structure they do have.
And honestly, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, I think they're all essentially describing the same things.
I know.
Yeah. They're using different language for it, but plot point number 1 and crossing the threshold, like they're the same things basically. And the midpoint, the supreme ordeal. I mean, it's different language for the same stuff. But yeah, K.M. Weiland is pretty good with her paradigm of it. Dan Wells has a nice short one. Michael Hagg has a good one. But really, we won't spend too much time going into those paradigms. This is more or less the one that you have used, Anne, right?
It is. Yeah, and I kind of promised that I would talk a little bit about what happened with my agent and editor this past week, because I offered up 5 more. Actually, were they all new? Probably not. I don't think they were all new, but actually, I think it was 6 this time. And he picked, the next one, and was hotly interested in 2 others. And we talked a great deal about each one, about how they would be developed in terms of their characterization. And I took notes on each one. And but the value of that for me was obviously I could show him that I have more ideas than just one. Also to get him kind of excited about different stories. And I think that's true, like very often agents, if you get a chance to talk to them, which they're incredibly, I've never met one I've never met an agent or an editor that was rude, honestly. But if you get a chance to talk to them, often they'll say, "What are you working on?" And then if they get interested, they'll say, "What else do you have?" And I always like to have something ready, because I have been in those situations where I don't have something and then I want to die. So I usually do try to have a couple of different ideas ready. So anyway, I know what my next one is going to be after this one, and I've actually already written, 70 pages of it or something. But
oh, great.
Yeah. So these, I really, again, I tend to write cinematically just because I'm a movie watcher and I read a lot of books, and I put those two things in my head. So I use that very common 3-act structure with the beginning, opening hook, an inciting incident sort of. And then at the end of the beginning is the beginning of Act 2. And then Act 2, what I like about this, the way that it's set up like this, is I know, okay, the easy part is done. And not that the first chapter is the hardest chapter to ever write. So that's not easy. But to get started, I think, is easy. And then Act 2 is when you really start get committed to your idea. And this is where the mushy middle begins to happen. And so if I know that I need to have these 3 big things in it, like partially way through, there needs to be something that really changes everybody's direction, then the midpoint reversal throws everything out the window and they really have to change entirely. And then there's another pinch point. There's my mushy middle held up by a bridge, which is really helpful for me. Especially, like, I've even gone so far as taken books that have done that very well, and I have made a graph so that I can see how many words in, how big is it, where is this happening, what I think this is this the midpoint? And I've charted it out, which is sort of an unusual behavior for me, but I was really studying story, and I was studying how to teach story. And that was one of the things that kind of helped me do that. I was take a book that I was like, oh, this person has this 3-act structure down pat. And so then I put it into an Excel sheet. And then Act 3 is, what I tend to do, I have to remember that the climax is a big deal. It's not the midpoint reversal, but we're constantly sort of moving towards the climax. And usually when I'm graphing out a story, this is the timeline actually, but I'll usually draw out pinch point, midpoint reversal, and then the climax, and it's rising towards it. And I often write too long of a denouement. You know how it is. Sometimes you're reading a book and you're like, there's 2 pages left. Where's the climax and the finish? Like, how are they going to possibly pull it off? And then sometimes they do, But this is like, for me, it's exactly like if I was creating, if I had toothpicks and I was creating a canopy, this is what it would look like. It's a bridge, right? It's helping me form the structure of my story and hold it aloft. So then Tim and I are always talking. We're always planning these talks when I'm walking Peanut, because I think I'm thinking my best when I'm walking always. And I've had my fresh cup of coffee, and it's usually sunny out, and I'm really alert because I'm trying to avoid all other dogs on the path. And so we started to talk a little bit about, is this okay? Can I start this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
This will illustrate these points a little bit better, right?
Yeah, I think so. So we said, let's talk about the idea that we were unpacking last class about the woman who delivers the bag of garbage next to the dumpster.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, we could just illustrate it a little bit. We could just see how it goes. And I said, like, for example, the opening image could be that the woman is, she's in her apartment and she's drunk. Maybe she's an alcoholic. I think we turned her into an alcoholic only because it was easy for us to talk about this. Mm-hmm. And then, so the inciting incident is that this person is dropping things off, and what's in those bags all the time is alcohol and food. And then so she gets used to it, right? And she gets used to this person doing it. And then at the end of the beginning, maybe the end of the beginning is the woman stops showing up. She doesn't show up anymore. And this, maybe our character doesn't go out and get her own alcohol for whatever reason. I don't think we actually sorted that out.
Yeah.
And so now we've got her in a position, right? And so I think what we decided was that the next thing is the woman shows up later and she says, I'll keep bringing your stuff, but you have to talk to me. And she agrees to it, maybe because she doesn't want to talk to anybody. And she's like, well, I'll talk to you, but we're not going to talk about me not drinking. And she's like, that's fine. Right. And then we decided, I can't decide what we decided about the midpoint reversing. Maybe we killed off the lady in the car and the books and the thing.
Yeah.
If
right.
we took it off, like maybe they got to be really good friends and she sort of stopped drinking for a while. And what she thought she wanted was to numb out her life. And so she was drinking all the time because maybe I remember what we talked about. I said, maybe she was some kid that was sort of dropped off at an orphanage or dropped off at a fire station or something. And she was always battling back this idea of not being wanted. And so she drank and drank and drank to fill that hole. So then when she got to know this lady who was bringing her stuff, she finds out later that that woman was bringing her stuff because somebody in her life had left it in the will that somebody had to always care for her. And so, and then maybe instead of drinking, she starts to figure out, well, who was that? And who was this woman? And then we start, because at first we had her just drinking to fill a hole. And later then what we find out is maybe for a minute that hole was filled with somebody because she had belonging there for a minute. And so maybe now she thinks that I only have to figure out who it was. The only way that I can belong, or the person I can belong to, is the person who understood that I needed alcohol all the time. And so she's set out to figure out who that was. And so she's searching really hard to find that particular person. But maybe that particular person isn't living either anymore. And she discovers something. And in the end, maybe she has to learn that she didn't have to have her biology. And maybe she finds out the reason that she was discarded, and it has nothing to do with what she thought it was, which was maybe I'm not worthy of love. So, and again, you guys, I could not be more spitballing it if I, like, the name of this book would be called Spitball. Although I want to write a book called The Supreme Ordeal. Like, how funny is that?
Yeah, that is good.
That's what when we were little, we called my kids' private portions, their private spaces. We called them their areas of utmost privacy. That's what makes me think of The Supreme Ordeal. Anyway.
So to reiterate some of this and maybe refine it a little bit, and by way of defining some of these things. So our opening image, hook, empathy, basically this hooks us to the story, but then establishes who the character is and gives us some empathy toward their situation, right? So this would just be a woman in her apartment, drunk. We maybe learn that she was an unwanted child or something, though that could also come later. But, what would there be? And this is sort of thing, again, we're sort of spitballing this. So there's some like TBDs here, right? Like to be determined, if we're going to flesh this out, because we're literally basically just inventing this now that we did toss around a few of these ideas. But, so the opening image is the woman in the apartment drunk. It establishes her as an alcoholic. We'd probably TBD, to be determined, some sort of hook that's going to make that a little bit more interesting than just a person miserable in their apartment, right?
Yeah. And somebody wrote here, they're asking how quickly does the opening of the book or the inciting incident need to occur?
Right.
I think, this is where we get into problems where, like, I've read a couple of books where people are blowing up in the middle of it. And like right in the first line, they've blown into the sky. And I think, well, that's a little early because I don't really care if they've blown into the sky because I don't know who they are. So I have to care before they get blown up. But I understand why people doing that, because they're just trying to follow the directions of grabbing somebody's attention right away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you write a strong enough introductory paragraph or so that gets us interested enough that we trust, that reader knows that something delicious is going to happen soon, then I think we're going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think if in shorthand, people will say, you got to get that incident right up front. And that is true. But more true, I think, is that you have to write a come hither paragraph or sentence that doesn't just set up the story, but entices the reader towards what is going to be the inciting incident.
How soon and when do yours occur? Your inciting incidents, how far into the book are they?
That's a good question. I haven't read my books for a while. Let me look here. I have them right here, though. Just in case, I just happen to have them right here. I played a podcast recently, and everybody was showing their books, or on a video recently, and they all had their books except me. The first chapter in I Like You Just Fine When You're Not Around is Tig is trying to imagine what it was like for her mother to lose her mind. And so that's not really an inciting incident, but it really is, because the crux of the whole thing is that, it's unfair that her mother has Alzheimer's. And so right away, we know that there's going to be some tension because somebody is losing their mind. So it's a very tense first sentence. The second one, this one is about Lucy is in a parking lot getting ready to go into work, and she sees a mother put her child into the baby seat, and she starts to cry. And so the first scene right there is, we know what her primary thing is. There's something to do with the child in her life. So there's tension right there. Those aren't necessarily the inciting incident that gets the whole story forward, but it's something that tells me, like, oh shit. And in the new book, she is trying to decide who her best friend called first when she found out her cancer was back. Was it her or their nemesis from college? Because she needs both of them. And so right away, we know that something very tense is going to be happening very soon. And we're setting up the characterization of it. And then, so this inciting incident for me usually happens right away in chapter 1, or like pretty soon in chapter 2. And that's true of all of them. Like, I think Lucy gets caught shoplifting almost right away, like pretty soon, I think, in the second chapter, maybe. But right away that she's kind of falling apart. So I think that what people are trying to say when they say get that inciting incident up front, I think what maybe they're trying to say is get their central conflict up front. Like, what is their problem? Honestly, Lucy's major problem was family, and I put it in the first sentence. Tig's major thing is her exhaustion and sadness of her mother losing her mind. That truly is her central thing. It's in the first line. And what she's got to get over, and and the fact that in my next book, those women are going to be fighting for the life of their friend, that's in the first line too. Did I think of that ahead of time? I think here's what I do, just FYI. I feel like I'm talking way too much, but like when I'm trying to tell a story, and I do this with Lisa Rowe, is my good friend, and she is a writer friend who will listen to me ad nauseum talk about my books. So will Tim lately. The two of you really get a lot of credit. But if I'm going to tell them a story of any sort, I have to know where to start that story. So my father would start all the stories with, I think we brought Mom to the doctor on Tuesday, but it could have been Wednesday. I'm not really sure. Were you here Tuesday or Wednesday? And then it's off to the races of boredom. Like, I just want to die. And so for me, I have to go, the beginning of the story is oh, okay, the beginning of the story is here, and then I can go forward. So sometimes I picture telling my friend this story, and where would I start if I was telling the story to her? Does that make sense? Because even my friends, I sort of have to hook them, like otherwise you know what it's like. People space off, right? People are sick of me talking about my books.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly as a lecturer, when I was teaching my students, I had to figure out what was the introductory sentence that was going to make them even the least bit interested in carbohydrates.
Right.
And, I would say, okay, you guys tattoo this one on your ass, fat burns in the flame of carbohydrate. And they'd be like, oh, and so, I would try to get them with an inciting incident, and whatever it is, it should be something that sort of really gets there. So I practice when I'm writing a story of how would I begin to tell this story if it were true, and how would I be interested?
I think there's a difference between the hook and the inciting incident, though, is that the hook is that there's some tension up front that's sort of emblematic of the current problem.
Yes.
For the character, but then the inciting incident is what really kicks off the story.
Yeah, because you set it up ahead of time. You're like this, like, see, this person can't swim at all, can't swim, never swam, never could swim, doesn't like water, and like, oh, a tsunami is here.
There you go. Right.
That would be the tsunami, right?
That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like the opening images could be this woman in her apartment drunk, and then maybe she gets a call from, I don't know, her sister or something, giving her some sort of news that's going to make her, that's bad news, that's going to make her even, sink even more into isolation and depression and drunkenness.
Right.
And then she'll soon after look outside in, maybe half drunk and see, through her blurry vision, some woman rummaging around near the dumpster, leaving a bag there.
Mm-hmm.
And think, wasn't that the same person that was there last week? And then the woman leaves and she goes down and she looks in that bag. And that is our actual inciting incident for the story,
mm-hmm.
which is then going to be about the relationship between those two people and the whole effort to get this drunk out of her house, etc.
Yeah.
So the inciting incident, when seeing the bags dropped off, right?
Mm-hmm.
The end of the beginning.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the end of the beginning, I think what we had talked about earlier was that there was a reluctance to let this person into the house, but that maybe the end of the beginning is that they actually have contact, like they actually talk, or the person who drops off the bags says, "Why don't you just let me in?" or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And so, I'll give it to you, but you got to let me in. I'm not leaving it here.
Right.
And she's like, I don't come out of the house. Okay, I'll come up there, but you got to let me in.
Right. So that's the crossing the threshold in the hero's journey, is like, there's now no going back.
Mm-hmm.
You have now developed a relationship with that person.
Yeah. And I was looking at one of the comments. Can you talk a little bit about more of a pinch point? What are their value, et cetera? And a pinch point it's sort of not the first. It's one of the nudges that is going to shove them towards the midpoint reversal. It's sort of like, it's like a parental thing. Like usually you let your kid fail before they drop the hammer. Well, that's a little bit what you're doing as a storyteller. You're kind of shoving them a little bit towards what's going to happen, because what you're trying to do is make your character so fed up that they're willing to change.
Mm-hmm.
So, sometimes, like if you drop the whole hammer on them right away, people are people. They'll be like, I can't do that. Like I always said, like if I knew how hard it was to publish a book, I never in a million years would have given it a try. So thank God I didn't know. So every little pinch point for me was, like a shove here, a rejection here. But if I had 100 rejections in one day, I'd go find something else to do. So as a storyteller, you're doing that too. You're giving them little pinches so that they move in some way. And then that movement is what's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We like to see what people are going to do. You know, like if you watch somebody walking, if you're looking out your window and somebody's just walking by, you'll look at them and they'll walk by. But if somebody is doing something else, going through their pocket, talking to a baby, dropping something, you'll like watch them for a minute because it's interesting. Because you don't know. And so that's what we're looking for, is for them to change and do something and move. So the pinch point holds the story aloft as they change, keeps things interesting, and nudges them. I know that people who have heard me speak before know that I like to call it the Roku method, because, or not Roku, Robo Vacuum. My Robo Vacuum, which I don't use very often because there's always too much crap on the floor and it gets all wound up in my dog's stuffed toys. But when I first did it, I was like watching it go for stuff, right? And there would be like a piece of popcorn. I'd be like, yeah, go get it. And I would start to go there, and then it would hit a table leg, and it would go. I'd be like, oh no! But it would go off, and I'd be like, here it goes again. And then it would hit another leg, and it would, and it was for a very boring type of person, it was very exciting to watch my Robo Vacuum go after it. And then if it got the popcorn, it was like, and the crowd goes wild. And so I think that that's a little bit what we're trying to do as storytellers. We're knocking them, even though they try. And then finally, my Robo Vacuum decides that the popcorn isn't really worth it. Sometimes it goes off into the kitchen, and they're off on a different trajectory then. And that's kind of what you're doing. You're giving them movement and roadblocks to see what are they going to do. You know, and we do this in life all the time. Like it's not so hard when you think about your own life. Like think about what you did. I went through 1 full year, 2 full semesters of graduate school in nursing before I realized they hated me and I didn't like them. And I realized for good reason. I was not good at what I was doing, and I didn't really like it. And so, but it took me to really struggle and fail before I realized that's not my thing. And so we're sort of asking you to do the same thing with your stories, watching how the most interesting stories unfold.
So pinch points, midpoints. There's this question here, but is there a difference between pinch point and plot point? Jennifer asks.
I mean, no. I think it's like you say, that they're often labeled in, kind of similar ways.
Right.
And I don't think so.
There are some paradigms that make that distinction, but it's not like an inherently logical distinction, really.
No, yes. And so I think for our purposes here, we can, you could say in your head, you could go, okay, yeah, there's that one plot point before the midpoint reversal. That's this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I think, what we want to do is, because there are lots of plot points, and there are lots of characters doing a lot of things in books, because obviously, that's what makes them interesting. But you have to figure out, amid the noise, what are those most important trajectories, and that's where your pinch points are. And somebody asked here, can inciting incident happen off the page? And they absolutely can, because it can move the whole story forward in lots of different ways. And for example, I mean, the inciting incident is pretty clear in the Hunger Games, because it's when Prudence gets called up on the thing. But the fact that the whole world was taken over by President Snow was probably an even larger inciting incident, but not necessarily the story of Katniss. And Katniss's inciting incident is her sister. Right. So sometimes people get a little bit, like, what is the inciting incident? Well, it has to do with your character. Remember, all things come back to your character. So it can, and often we have to think really hard about what is that inciting incident. And I use the example of To Kill a Mockingbird, because what many people would say is the inciting incident would be the kid's mom's dying. That would be off the page, except that isn't the inciting incident.
Yeah.
It's their Dill comes to town.
Right.
And because everything changes because Boo, their relationship with Boo is everything. So I can see why there's a lot of question about, especially when you're trying to define it for your own story. Like, what is my inciting incident? And one of the best ways that I can say to kind of figure that out is call up your friend and say, I'm going to pretend my character is a real person. I'm going to tell you her story right now. And then that person can go again. And then you go, yes, just listen for a minute. And then you can say, Lucy Peterman, she got into a car accident and lost her baby. And then she'll go, oh, that's too bad. I'll be like, oh, no, that's not the story. The story is this doctor at the hospital got caught for shoplifting. That's the beginning. Because then she goes, my friend would be like, really? And get this, she's not even shoplifting good stuff. She's shoplifting like Depends and 4x4s and, syringes and stuff. And then she's like, why? Was she starting her own clinic? No, like nobody knows why. She's got thousands of dollars worth of stuff in her bedroom. She locked them in there. She's got like a whole hospital store. Oh, well, is she sick? Well, yeah, they think she's addicted. So they're going to send her to AA. Oh, but is she an alcoholic? Like, is she that kind of addicted? She doesn't say she is. She doesn't think she is. She's just mad. Well, why is she stealing stuff? Well, she lost her husband and child. Oh, so that's her coping mechanism. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, that's how I would tell the story. I'm look at that. I just had a whole conversation with me and my friend right in front of you. And I didn't even mind. And
no,
Jim was totally absorbed.
But to answer that question, I would agree with you, but can the inciting incident occur prior to the start of the story? Essentially, no. There'll be some sort of, preamble to the story that creates a kind of a problem that already exists in the world. But we want to see the inciting incident happen because it's what really the story is then about. Like you said, her losing her, what was it, her child or something? Like that is in some ways an inciting incident, but not really, because this story is about, well, what happened as a result of her getting caught for shoplifting, right?
Right.
So we do want to see that get kicked off in some way.
And she does, right?
Right.
So yes. And so like my friend isn't interested until I say what's interesting about her. Unless we both knew her. If we both knew her, like, oh my God, they just got into a car accident, she lost her husband, then that's the inciting incident, right? Because we know her. But if you don't know her and I'm just telling you a story about some lady that happened, then I better have something interesting to say. Unless it's just she's lost her husband and she miscarried. You're like, oh, that's too bad. Hey, did I tell you about the sale at Shopko? Or, like we have to have more.
Yeah.
And so I pretend. And then I can kind of figure out what the story is. And you can do it with anybody who isn't annoying, because they'll be like, wait, why are you telling me this story? Oh, because blah, blah, blah made me think of it. And that was and it was actually a shoplifting story. Oh. So if you,
right.
If you're talking to good listeners and good friends, they can inadvertently help you tell these stories.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we have some other questions, and I think just maybe get some clarity around pinch point, midpoint, crisis. I think everyone knows what a climax is.
Mm-hmm.
And the denouement or resolution. But yeah, so that some of those middle things, and there's Maggie talks about filling Act 1, establishing the character. Act 1 is really, what would you say, like 20% of the story?
Yeah, it's short.
It's pretty short.
It's really short. You have trouble filling Act 1 because I have to establish a character and the premise and the setting before the story really kicks in. But you know what? You can hint at the story and the premise and the character without filling it fully in. Like you can say she lost somebody, and then later on you tell us who, unless it's really important for building empathy. Or you can, like I use that beginning to set up all of the questions that are going to be answered later. So it's a whole come hither. So I know what you're saying, Maggie. I totally get that. You don't have to have all of the answers in those first things, but you can promise that you're going to fill them in later. And that's what you do. They're all little kickoffs. And so that's what I usually do. Because you're right, 75 pages into that and it's really boring. But if you just, you keep the tension high, you show that there's a lot of tension in these beginning things, and then you allude to the answers to these questions later.
Lita, is a pinch point something that forces the character to go one way only?
I think no. I mean, I think that's such a good question, because I think sometimes I do something and then I wait, and then after I do it, I think to myself, where would they go then? What would happen next? And then I think, if it goes in that direction, that's not going to work. So then I maybe change to a different pinch point. Like I kind of go through it in my head a little bit. Because Tim and I were doing that when we were talking about how to talk to you guys about building out a story. I'd be like, oh, but if she does that, that won't be interesting. Okay, let's back up and go in a different direction. So I wouldn't necessarily say that I am not planning my whole novel when I'm writing these pinch points out, but I am using a general understanding of story and knowing that what they want and moving the chess pieces around in the best way that I can. But I don't always know exactly in what direction my characters are going to turn. I really do a lot of discovery in my books.
Yeah, and we can come back to some of these questions, but this is our last point, which is that you're doing a lot of that discovery writing, or pantsing, which some people hate that term, and
yeah,
I might be one of them. But backstory, shading, characterization, history, you say often come later as you're writing, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And you don't know the full trajectory of your protagonist until you've written the draft, but you use structure as a sort of rough outline to give you some guidance for the story, right?
Yeah, to help me sort of, I keep thinking back to the first comment there that said it can be jelly mess. I don't work very well with a jelly mess because I get overwhelmed. So if I put these places and and I also think of it as a living document that can be changed and changed and changed. Like anything I put on paper is just like tacked in place, really, with light tacks, because I know that I could change it. So when I did the pitch for this book, I thought you said this could work. I didn't even have a main character that ended up being in the very first to the very last scenes, or maybe third, second chapter in. She discovered them second or third chapter in. I didn't even have her in my mind. But as I was writing, I thought, oh, we need somebody. And she just came to me, and I stuck her in there. But I did not know that ahead of time. So mostly the structure that I'm writing is a pretty skeleton structure to help me organize it in a classic story structure way, because I know that is proven. It's the only knowing thing I know, is that people like to tell stories a certain way. So why not pin my hat on that? And then I know that it's going to be very flexible, and I know that I'm going to have to build it out as I go. And I know that, and I'm a very layered writing. Like I know a lot of people, like they polished it all the way through. But I do not do that. Because I'm learning about my character as I go through, I write, I have a good idea, an outline, I know what I'm doing, I write the whole thing. And then I was using this example for Tim the other day. It's like, how when you do what was it called again? dot, 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 one,
Oh, connecting the dots. Yeah.
dots. You know how you connect all the dots and it becomes a horse head? Well, then later, once you have the horse head, you could shade it all brown, and then you can put in a mane, and then you can put in brown eyes with long lashes, and then maybe the third time you go through it, you give it some muscles, and it created into a full story. And that's the way that I write, because I can't think it all through, and I never would do it right the first time.
Mm-hmm.
Not that organized in my brain. And I marvel at people that can do that, but that's not something that I can do.
And so you're really, just to clarify, you're really not, I mean, there are out there sort of structural purists who say, like, here's your outline, here's the percentage points at which you need to hit these various plot points or pinch points, and and fill in everything from there, and so you're not so much, what you're doing is you're taking your back cover synopsis, and you're figuring out, okay, here's my back cover synopsis, here's my log line, here's my pitch, my comps, and then when you sent, for instance, for the novel you're now writing, you then sent like a 4 or 5 page, like about a 2,000 word outline that actually used these headings. And I'll back up to this. It used these headings, and you just had a little paragraph about what happens under each of these headings in that story. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to go back and look at that and see, like, to what extent you're still faithful to that. But then it was a lot of, that has your roadmap, and then you're doing a fair amount of discovery writing within that sort of roadmap, right?
Yeah. Yep. And it's really, it's the only way that I can work. But I will say, I've written, how many books have I written? 3, 4, 2 in a drawer. So I've written 6 books. And I'm a relatively new writer. Stephen King, I'm sure, doesn't do this. Who knows what he does? He probably just, who knows how he does it? He seems to just burp out his wonderful books, and they happen. But there are a lot of writers who have many, many, many more books than I do. And I guess I haven't had a chance to ask them what their process is for that. And maybe they don't know it as well. I spend a lot of time thinking about it so that I can teach it. And I look really closely at it, I think, just because I'm a teacher. And it's important to me to kind of, because people are asking me all the time, and I want to have an answer for them. So I look very closely in the way that I do it in my process.
Yeah. And I keep coming back to the descriptive versus prescriptive thing, that I'm always just really twitchy when I hear any writer say, this is what you should do. And I think even Stephen King has said something very disparaging about people who outline.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, okay, that's fine for you, Stephen. You write like 4 novels a year.
Yeah.
And like your sense of story is maybe a little more refined than most people.
Right.
And so what works for you is great, but if we're talking about, writing 1 to 4 novels in your life instead of 90,
yeah,
it might be a different approach for us, and that's okay, right?
Yeah. I really, really bristle at absolutes.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, of course I use them myself because I tend to speak like that sometimes, but I just don't like absolutes because everybody is so different. And I'm like really love listening to how other people do it, even though I don't do it that way or whatever. They might be an idea of something to add to the way that I do it. Yeah. Right. I don't like absolutes, and I think it's really arrogant to say there's always exceptions. So I think we're over time. Are we usually?
We should wrap up in the next couple minutes. But I guess if there's any last questions here that Maureen, very good question. That one might be something we could answer in email, because that's a very unique situation, handling a novel containing a play.
Yeah.
Amy Lou, what percentage of the book do you usually devote to Act 2 and 3? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, 2/3 of the book is Act 2 and 3. It's just really the first third or the first quarter of the book that's Act 1, depending. And then
Yeah.
the story moves forward mostly from the midpoint, from pinch point 1 on, and the very last part is the shortest part. So, it's like a bridge. The center part is the largest part of the story. It's just set up and finish.
Right. Act 2 is often like at least 50 to 60% of the whole book, right?
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and again, I know people do percentages. I'm just not really that kind of a person where my writing is concerned. I certainly did that when I was a scientist, but as a writer, I think if I get too wrapped up in percentages, then I lose the feeling of the art in the story, and I start to feel like, am I doing it wrong? Am I doing it wrong? So I try really hard not to do that, but it's really useful for other people. So, and certainly you could find websites that'll tell you right down to the word count of what each one should be and how long they should be.
Right.
Um,
Right.
I usually will have people read it, and I'll say, I want you to make notations in the manuscript wherever you're bored. Let me know
Yeah.
when you're
Yeah.
so that I can see where that might be. So I'm a little bit more loosey-goosey about that, I think. What are we talking about next after this?
Yeah. Pitch worthiness and log lines and comps, sorry.
Because we could talk more about these conflicts a little bit next time too, because everything sort of overlaps. So if you're not really getting what you need particularly, we want to make sure that, because that's one of the things about this, is that each thing overlaps a little bit, and we try to build it out a little bit. My word count for novels is about 80,000.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so yeah, pitch worthiness, logline, and comps coming up, and yeah, we can sort of spill some of these questions into next time if there isn't enough clarity about some of them. Crisis is a really good question. Crisis versus climax. Crisis is really sort of, I think of it as like the decision point. It's bringing you to a point where you're going to decide that you need to face the climax.
Yeah. Right. It sort of happens just before. Like, I'm in a crisis. I can see it coming. It's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I got to decide whether I'm going to turn around and go in the other direction or going to move through it. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it happens just before the conflict.
Right. So, okay. So we'll leave some of these for next time. Email me, you guys, if you have other questions, and we'll spill these into next time. So my email is right here on this page. You can see it right there with that PayPal link, td@stormwritingschool.com. And again, as you can see, these are sort of off the cuff. We're planning these, we're putting thought into these, but we're also wanting them to be pretty organic as we're coming into them. So we're really quite amateur about marketing these things and getting the word out. And so if you can spread the word for us, that'd be great. As we said, the next couple ones coming up, pitch worthiness and logline and comps in the next couple weeks. But yeah, and I just thank you so much to people who have donated in the past. It's helping us out, and these are by no means lucrative things, and we are not marketing whizzes in this realm at all. But
we're terrible at it. It keeps up too fast. That's what happens.
They do come up too fast, but it is fun to have this sort of regular schedule to things to keep them going.
I know. If people have ideas, you should send Tim ideas about other things that you might want to do when we're done with this thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Fun, and I like to do it, and may as well do it. It's fun.
Absolutely.
It's a little weird. I will say it's a little weird to, like, usually when I'm teaching, I can look at people's faces, and if something has fallen flat, I move on. So it's a little weird to not be able to see everybody's faces.
It is, right.
Whether because I very often will judge of whether I'm doing a good job based on people's expressions, but I can't see them this time. So
right. All right. Well, thank you all. Thanks so much for coming and showing up. And we'll see you hopefully in about a week.
Sounds good. We'll see you later, you guys. Thank you again.
Take care.
Bye-bye.